Hello, ladies. This is another presentation. This one is on externalities in chapter 10. Oops, I've got a bit of a weird thing going on there. I'll just change the lighting a wee bit. Excuse me a minute. Is that going to make any difference? No, it's not. Let's change the other one. Sorry about that. Normal service will be resumed as soon as possible. So, as I mentioned, sorry about that. The theme for booklet, Making Markets Work, and we're looking at externalities, which basically is chapter 10, and that starts on page 52. Now, you will have covered this in year one. Pretty sure you would have covered this with Mrs. M, but this is just a bit of revision and bringing it a bit more into context. Let's take a look at the first thing then, just to sort of start you off. How about drawing a mind map and showing some positive and negative externalities of economic activity in our local area? So give yourself 10 minutes just to have a think about some of the positive and negative externalities of things that are going on in and around our county. And then obviously we can use that as a context to discuss externalities and some of the issues that revolve around them. So, what are we going to learn about in this topic? We're going to look at a number of things. First is private, external, and social costs and benefits. Okay, so when we're trying to consider whether some of the things that are being produced are good and worthwhile, then we need to think about both the private costs and the external or social costs and benefits, and we'll look at those in a bit more detail in a minute with some examples. We also need to look at the impact on society of charging prices that don't reflect the total internal and external costs, as we'll see, and in some cases that might lead to market failure of some description and possibly government intervention to try and address those things. We'll certainly be looking at environmental externalities and also moving on to look at the overall picture as far as how both businesses and government might deal with externalities to try to reduce their effect, I suppose. So one way in which we can start to look at this is to use marginal analysis. Now, we've used the term marginal cost, marginal revenue on umpteen occasions over the last few months, and this is yet another example where we can start to use marginal analysis to help us to understand these principles. So what we're going to do is start by looking at how we can understand externalities by using marginal analysis. So effectively, marginal analysis, where if you think about what we've said when we talk about margins, marginal cost, marginal revenue, it's basically looking at the benefit or cost that we receive from consuming or producing one more unit. So again, we're looking at the edges again and trying to see whether one unit makes a significant difference. Okay, so if we take a look at the two areas that we're going to consider, one is the marginal benefit, and that's the benefit to a consumer of consuming one more unit or good of a good or a service. And the marginal cost is effectively, I suppose, marginal benefit is similar to marginal revenue in one sense, isn't it? But in this case, it's about the benefit that the consumer receives from consuming one more unit, and the marginal cost in this case is the cost to a producer of producing that one extra unit, which again is exactly what we talked about previously. Now, in terms of how we try and arrive at this, then, in terms of using this marginal benefit and marginal private benefit and marginal private cost, these are two things that we can do to really try and understand and enhance our understanding of externalities. Okay, so if we think about the way in which this might work, let's just take a look at how it all sort of plays out. So this marginal private benefit, or also known as MPB, is the amount of additional satisfaction that a consumer gains from an additional unit of a good or service. So MPB is the marginal private benefit. Okay, Now we can use that, and it's actually represented by the demand curve. Okay, so you can see in this situation when we're trying to assess externalities and the effect that it might have, we can use the marginal private benefit, what we're willing to pay, if you like, for the goods and services that consumers want to consume. So in this instance, as you can see, we've got this drawn in where we got price against quantity, and at 50 units, looking at our demand curve, downward sloping for all the reasons we talked about before, partly to do with the marginal utility, and also the fact that as we or diminishing utility rather, but the fact that as we consume more, we tend to get less benefit from each extra item that we're consuming in terms of satisfaction or utility. Okay, so in this instance, as we can see, 50 units, so where the consumers are willing to pay £10 for those 50 units. Okay, £10 each. Oops. And effectively, that's what that's saying is that the consumer is deriving at least, or well, £10 worth of benefit from each unit that they choose to consume. And obviously, as we talked about this, we can recognise that the lower price, the reason why our demand curve slopes downwards is because the satisfaction decreases as we consume more, and as a result of that, the price will also fall for further units. Okay. So if we then take a look at the other things that we've got to try and balance up to see whether we're actually achieving positive or negative externalities, which is what we're going to look at in a bit more detail in a minute, we also need to consider this principle of price and where it equals marginal cost. Now, the reason for that is that essentially, if we can find the point at which price that we're selling at equals the marginal cost, then effectively we are achieving allocative efficiency. Okay, and if you think about it, let's say if we can keep selling at or find a point at which we can produce at the optimum level of output, well, that would be it, wouldn't it? Where price and marginal costs were equal, that would be the point at which we would stop producing, and that would be the point at which we make the most profit. So in this case, if we think about the price of producing that product, the marginal cost of producing it is when firms should increase output. Okay, so what I mean by that is if we're actually if it's above, the price is above that level, above the level of marginal cost, we will keep increasing output. If the price is above the cost of production, then again, firms will increase output and they will achieve more profit. Let's think about that again. So if our selling price is above the cost of production, any firm will choose to increase output and make additional profit until they get to the point where the marginal cost, the cost of that extra unit, is actually higher than the price that we're selling it for. So in this instance, clearly a firm will actually allocate more resources into producing that product until we get to the point where price is equal to marginal cost. And at that point, the firm is clearly maximizing its profits, because again, if the selling price is for one extra unit is higher than the marginal cost for producing that, well, even if it's just by 5 pence, 10 pence, whatever, then you are still making a small profit. And if we are maximizing profits, remember, as a firm, what we're trying to do is to get the maximum amount of profits from our output, and that would be the reason why we would carry on producing until we reach that level of output. As soon as we get to a point where our marginal cost was greater than the price, the selling price that the firm could sell the goods at, we would actually essentially be making a loss if we were that business on every additional unit that we produced. And clearly that would be not particularly good for us, and also not productively very efficient either. So let's take a look at how this sort of translates, and let's look and see. We talked about marginal cost, and we're going to look at marginal private cost in a minute. And effectively, in the same way as we talked about the demand curve reflecting the marginal private benefit, in this instance, we're looking at the supply curve being the same as the marginal private cost. Okay, so if we think about this and just break it down for a minute, as we've got, as a producer, if our costs increase, we can only make a profit if the price, the selling price of any additional unit is either higher or equal to the cost of producing that additional unit. Okay, so in this instance, the point at which the firm is going to stop supplying will be the point at which where the additional cost is higher than the price received for selling that particular extra unit. And so when we take a look at the marginal private cost curve, which is shown here, okay, which essentially is the supply curve too, this is the point at which we're looking at marginal private costs. So it's the cost to the producer of providing those units. Okay, and you can see in this instance that the marginal private cost has a close relationship between the costs and the price and the quantity supplied of that product. And again, the higher the price that a supplier can produce, then the more supply will be provided. Okay, so in terms of marginal private cost, then we've sort of explained that, so we just sort of re-summarize, if you like. The marginal private cost is the cost to the producer of producing an additional unit. Okay, that can be represented by the supply curve, and again, that is where we're showing the price of an additional item or additional unit being produced pays for the cost of producing the extra unit that the firm will supply. The supply curve in this case reflects the higher prices that will lead to more being supplied, because clearly if suppliers can sell for a higher price, then that's going to attract more of them into the market, and that essentially is then going to mean that more product will be supplied, and firms will be covering their costs for producing extra additional units in this situation. As we can see, as price increases, that increases the supply, because again, it's more likely that more producers will be able to cover their costs, and so move into the market and hopefully make some profit for themselves. Okay, so let's take a look at marginal social benefits and then marginal social costs then. Okay, now in essence what we're saying here is we've looked at the marginal private benefit and the marginal private cost, but where we're trying to consider the issues around social benefits and social costs of products and services, we need to try to consider this extra element. And the first thing is marginal social benefits, okay, also known as MSB, and this will help us to understand the principle of externalities to a greater extent. Okay, so these are the benefits. So MSB's marginal social benefits are the benefits of consuming or producing an additional unit of goods, of a good or a service, and they are the benefits that are received by society. Okay, so in essence, if we want to try to calculate the overall marginal social benefit, we're going to need to think about the marginal private benefit and also the marginal external benefits. Okay, so those people in society that aren't necessarily consuming those goods, but they are getting some sort of external benefit from the purchase of those goods or the use of those goods or services. Okay, so when we think about that, we've also then got to try and balance up the marginal social costs. Okay, so in the same way as we've got marginal social benefits for certain products, in some cases we've got marginal social costs, and these are the costs of consuming or producing an additional unit of good or service that are paid for by society in some way. Okay, and this would include marginal private costs. So the marginal social cost would basically be the marginal private cost plus any marginal external costs too. Okay, so when we talk about this in sort of abstract, it's slightly difficult to understand, but I think when we start to look at how we can graphically represent this, I think it probably makes a bit more sense. So we'll move on and look at that now. So in essence, what we want to try and do is to look for the market optimum position, okay? And that basically is where marginal private, from an economic standpoint, is where we've got marginal private benefit and marginal private cost equaling one another, okay? And markets generally will operate at that point, as we'll see. So if we've got, particularly if we've got a free market economy, the economic unit, the organisation that is actually producing that good or service, is only really considering the private costs or benefits of its activities, okay? Now, what that means effectively, that consumers and producers will operate in a market where effectively the marginal private benefit equals the marginal private cost. That's clearly, as we talked about before, it's going to lead to maximization of private benefit. Okay, so if we are getting private benefit, consumers are getting private benefit at the point at which producers are willing to produce at at a certain private cost, marginal private cost, then we're in a situation where if the marginal private benefit is less than the marginal private cost, okay, then in that situation, marginal private benefit is less than marginal private cost, consumers will actually achieve additional benefits from consuming. That makes sense. Yeah, of course it does. Yeah. So in that scenario, we're gaining extra benefits. Okay. However, if we're in a situation where the marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal private cost, then producers can achieve additional profits by increasing supply. Now, clearly, when it comes to marginal private benefit and marginal private cost being equal, then we have a market that's in equilibrium. Okay, so we've not really considered any of the external benefits or costs yet. All we're really doing is looking at the point at which free markets would be in equilibrium, and that's where effectively marginal private benefit equals marginal private cost. Okay, so let's have a look and see why, if we get any externalities, why that can sometimes lead to market failure. Okay, so we can have both positive and negative externalities, and both can lead to forms of market failure, because in some cases, either the private consumer or the producer is not paying for or actually receiving the full cost or benefit of that economic activity. Okay, so one could argue that if free markets are supposed to allocate resources, or any sort of market is supposed to allocate the resources in the most efficient way, you could argue that if we do have any form of externalities, then that is causing some sort of market failure. Okay, so as we said before, in a market economy, the economic unit really only interested in private costs or benefits of its activities, but that doesn't take into account the social benefits or costs that may occur. And there are 4 ways in which we can consider this, and we're going to look at each of these in a graphic sense in a minute too, and try to explain that in a little bit of detail. So, as I mentioned, 4 categories. 1 is negative production externalities. 2 is negative consumption externalities. 3 is positive production externalities. And 4 is positive consumption externalities. Okay, now you can imagine that these are all going to be reasonably similar. But in each case, the scenario is slightly different, and hopefully we'll be able to explain that reasonably clearly with the use of some graphs to show. So let's take a look at negative production externalities first then. Okay, and that's where we have a situation where the activities of a producer lead to costs to a third party that are not included in the price of the economic activity. Now we've drawn in an example here of a supply and demand graph to demonstrate the point, okay, and then we'll try and narrate this through with some extra text that we'll put onto the slide as we go. Okay, so let's try and explain this step by step then. So there's the graphic representation of it, and let's take a look at the first statement then. So the firm's optimal level of output would be Q, as we can see. And society's optimal level of output would be Q1. Okay, now again we'll look at the differences for that and how that might work. Okay, so in this situation, then the firm is actually overproducing by a factor of Q minus Q1. Okay, so the firm is quite happy to produce at this point, and again, it's only really interested in the marginal private cost, not interested in the marginal social cost. And so in essence, what they would be doing is looking to see where demand is and supply are in equilibrium, and that's the point at which they would produce on this basis. Okay, so let's take a look at the next point then. Okay, so at this point, if this is happening, the argument is that the price is actually too low. You can see price at P as opposed to P1 at the Q1 production level, and output is too high. And as a result of that, in essence, what we're saying is that there is allocative inefficiency, okay, on the basis of what we're also going to look at in a minute. Okay, so in the diagram, effectively, we're showing that the supply curve is taking into account just the supply curve S is taking into account just the cost, the marginal private cost. Okay, it's not taking into account the marginal social cost at all. Okay, so it's essentially the private cost. Okay, what it's costing the producer to produce. If we look at and try to include the cost to society, then the supply curve would essentially shift to the left, shift upwards and to the left to S1, and that's the point at which we would be getting, including the marginal social cost. Okay, so in this instance, clearly there is a marginal social cost that needs to be considered, and if that were the case, the cost to society of this negative externality will be greater than the cost to the producer. So if we were to include those social costs, i.e. the full cost, then we would actually operate, or the market would operate at S1. And if we then look at that, the point at which the demand would be at that level at Q1, as we mentioned earlier, that is essentially going to be mean that our demand curve and our supply curve S1 actually are at equilibrium, where P1, higher price, P1 and Q1 are at equilibrium. So in this situation, we've essentially got a position where there's an extra cost to society or welfare loss that can be seen by the grey shaded area here. Okay, so we're saying that if producers haven't considered the marginal social cost and they're not interested in it, then the argument is that there is a cost to society or a welfare loss, and that's measured by the difference between the social cost and the private cost at output between the levels of Q and Q1. Okay, so hopefully that makes it reasonably clear that then this essentially is our production negative, or the negative production externalities demonstrated by the fact that there are extra social costs, not just private costs considered, and this is how you would demonstrate that in a diagrammatic fashion. Okay. Now there are three more of these to look at. So effectively, we're going to now look at positive production externalities, and you will see that in this case, the similar sort of scenario where we've got extra production and some welfare gain in this instance. Okay, so where we got positive production externalities, that occurs when the activities of the producers lead to a benefit for a third party that are not included in the price of the economic activity. Okay, and in this situation, we may actually get some welfare gain. Okay, and the welfare gain is defined when the social cost is actually lower than the private cost, and society gains and doesn't have to pay for that difference, essentially. Okay, so we'll go through the same process again of just explaining the way in which these this graphic representation demonstrates positive production externalities. Okay, so in this case, we've got a situation where our optimal level of output for the firm is at Q. Okay, so this is the point at Q, and obviously when we take a look at the optimum level for society, then that is at output level Q1. Okay, so that means that in this scenario, that the firm is actually underproducing by Q minus Q1. The firm is choosing to produce at that lower level. Okay, even though society might require some more. Okay, so in this situation, the price is too high and the output is too low, and there is effectively allocative inefficiency at that point, in the same way as we looked at the previous example. If we then take a look at the point at where we've got a second supply curve at S1, which includes the marginal social cost, okay, but you can see that in this instance it's down and to the right, so it's shifted downwards and to the right. Okay, so S1, sorry, is down to the right of S, which is the marginal private cost. So it's included the marginal social benefit here. And in this instance, it's a positive externality because the social cost is actually lower than the cost of the producer. So social costs were included in this principle, okay, and then the full cost would be the point at which we'd operate for the market to be come into equilibrium, and essentially that would be S1, where S1 equals D, so that's the new market equilibrium, and essentially where Q1 and quantity 1 and price level 1 are the levels at which we operate. In this situation, then, we can see that the society would benefit. There would be some welfare gain, again shown by the grey area, which measures the difference between the social cost and the private cost at different output levels. Okay, so clearly demonstrating the similar sort of principle, but in this case where the marginal social cost is lower than the marginal private cost, the overall costs are slightly lower. Let's then take a look at negative consumption externalities then, and this happens when activities of consumers lead to a loss of benefit to a third party that are not included in the price of the economic activity. So again, we've shown how that works graphically, and let's just talk it through. So at this point, if we've got let's just take a look at how this all works. So we've got a position where the consumer's optimal level of output is a Q. And you can see that's the point at which, if we took that position there, the society's optimal level, the consumer's optimal level is at Q, but society's optimal level is at Q1. So effectively, at this point, the consumer is actually over-consuming by Q minus Q1. That means that effectively there is a loss of benefit to society, or a welfare loss, and that can be seen again by the grey shaded area here. Okay, and that measures the difference between the social benefit and the private benefit at different levels of output between Q and Q1. So in this scenario, the consumer gains benefits of consuming a good or a service on the demand curve D in the first instance. So that's the marginal private benefit. However, when we come to look at the marginal social benefit, in this case, the demand curve shifts downwards somewhat, because in this position, the social benefit is below and to the left of the private benefit, as benefits to society of a negative externality will lower the benefits to the individual consumer. Okay, and at this position, the consumer will maximize its private benefit, where S equals D at PQ. So if we look at S and D, that's where our consumer would maximize their private benefit. However, if the social benefits were included, then they would operate at S equals D1, where effectively we would be talking about P1 and Q1. That's the equilibrium point of for the market. Okay, so the last one is the positive consumption externalities. Okay, and that's where effectively the activities of consumers lead to benefits to a third party that are not included in the price of the economic activity. Okay, so in this instance, our consumer's optimal output is Q. Society's optimal level of the output is Q1. So society is actually benefiting over and above the individual consumer by the factor of Q minus Q1. So in this instance, the consumer is actually under consuming, okay? Now, in this case, the benefit to society of or welfare gain can be shown by the grey area again, and this measures the difference between the social benefit and the private benefit at those different output levels of Q and Q1. So in this instance then, the consumer gains the benefit of consuming the good or the service on the demand curve D. Okay, so this is the point at which the marginal private benefit equals our demand curve. However, the social benefit is above and to the right, because in this situation, the private benefit of D1, where we've included our marginal social benefits as well as the marginal marginal private benefits, is basically giving us a positive externality, which will be greater than the benefits to the individual consumer. So at that point, the consumer will maximize its private benefit where S and D are at equilibrium, okay, and so the price would be at P and our quantity demanded would be at Q. However, if the social benefits were included, then we would operate at a slightly different position where, in essence, our supply would be at D1, our supply would equal D1 at the new point of equilibrium, and effectively we would be getting a situation where the social benefits were also included, and that would give us a new equilibrium point for showing demonstrating positive consumption externalities. Okay, so if we take a look at this diagram then and just try and break down exactly where we might go and how we might sort of explain it, we've got marginal private and social benefit curves, and we've got marginal private and social cost curves. Okay, so in this case, we're trying to assess where the market equilibrium might occur, and if we take a look at QE, that is the point at which marginal private benefit and marginal private cost are at equilibrium. However, if we consider that, and that's the way in which we might normally go about that whole process, we wouldn't be considering the marginal social benefit or the marginal social cost. Okay, and in that scenario, that would be a slightly different position. So we could improve the allocation of resources better by increasing price and reducing output, so that MSB and MSC are actually the point at which we would produce at Q1. Okay, so that's where we would be considering both the marginal social cost as well as the marginal private cost, and also the marginal social benefit as well as the marginal private benefit. Okay, and in this situation, the optimal allocation of resources to society, where we're considering societal benefit as well, would be MSB, and where MSB and MSC intersect, where that would be the new equilibrium point. Okay, so why do externalities lead to market failure then? Well, we've argued that the social optimum position is where marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost. However, there is always going to be if there is some divergence between private costs and benefits and social costs and benefits, then at some stage the government will attempt to intervene to try and prevent the market from failing to allocate resources in the best possible way. So in certain situations, that might be needed. So in order to eliminate externalities as a market failure, we need to be operating as close to the point where marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost. Clearly, if we take a look at the 4 examples of externalities that we've just looked at, then that's fairly unlikely to happen. And as we've said, economic units tend to look to operate where the marginal private benefit equals the marginal private cost, because that's really all they're interested in. One could argue if they were sustainable and wanted to be a good citizen, and then maybe you could argue they should be considering the point at which MSB equals MSC. However, in most instances, most profit maximizing economic units will be looking to be performing at that point. Society is clearly going to benefit where marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost. And clearly, in this case, one could argue that it's not just producers that are being the bad boys. Consumers will, to some extent also be, based on the choices they're making, not necessarily considering the needs of society. Although I think that might be changing and probably will change over time. Generally speaking, when you're making a purchase decision, you're thinking about the marginal private benefit you're likely to get, rather than how is this going to benefit others in society. And clearly, in that scenario, that's where the government would step in and attempt to intervene to try to influence those markets to become more allocatively and productively efficient. So a few tests for you to take a look at, a few questions for you to consider, and I'll leave you to ponder that. You might need to look back at some of the previous slides in order to answer that, but look at what negative externalities are and when they might exist. Another quick test for you to take a look at market equilibrium and the point at which it occurs at QE. What point would that will best improve the allocation of resources? So again, think about what we talked about and take into account both the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost, but also the marginal social benefit and the marginal private benefit when you're considering that. A quick question on demerit goods that again you can have a go at answering. And then we're going to just look at and finish off with some examples of externalities. And in this case, we're looking at environmental externalities. So there are a number of different ways in which the government tries to address this. Excuse me. One is pollution permits. There is some emissions trading principles that go on, and also a whole range of different types of government measure attempting to improve the situation as far as environmental damage and climate change and pollution are concerned. Okay, so massive debate about the best way to control pollution. Some commentators believe that there should be a tax on carbon emissions, and in some cases that is happening right now. But others believe that a permit to pollute the system is more effective. So effectively, if you pollute the system, then you've agreed that how much you're going to pollute. But also, one could argue that you might be able to trade that permit, and it might lead to a more efficient way of controlling pollution. But there are some links for you to take a look at, which will help you to understand that. And again, it's maybe a debate that some of you might be particularly interested in. So take a look at that, and we can discuss that when we get together for our discussions in the next online tutorial. So this is what we've looked at. We've looked at the issue of externalities, tried to demonstrate the difference between private, external, and social costs and benefits, and how, in some cases, the impact on society of producing or charging prices at a certain point don't necessarily reflect the full internal or external costs, and that leads to externalities, and then leads to, in some cases, to the government trying to intervene to try to address market failure. Okay, so thank you for listening once more. I will catch up tomorrow in the in your double Friday 1 and 2, period 1 and 2, and we can discuss the details then.